Amos Hartwell rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, and every woman on the main street instinctively pulled her shawl a little tighter, not because the wind had picked up, but because something about the way he sat that horse made the air feel charged and dangerous, like the moment before a storm splits the sky clean open. He was 26 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled just slightly at the collar of his worn leather duster, and eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over the plains. His reputation preceded him the way smoke precedes fire. In Dodge City, they said he had kissed the sheriff's wife at her own birthday party and walked out laughing. In Wichita, they said he had won 3 horses, a cattle ranch deed, and a silver pocket watch in a single poker game, and then gambled them all away the following night without losing a wink of sleep. In Abilene, they said a few things that the women repeated only in whispers when the men were out of earshot. He drank hard, he played harder, he charmed every woman who crossed his path, and he never, not once, stayed anywhere long enough to leave a shadow behind him. The mothers of Caldwell knew his type on sight. They had all married steadier men, responsible men, men who came home when they said they would and kept their boots on the porch and their hands to themselves. They had warned their daughters about men like Amos Hartwell, the way you warn a child about a beautiful snake coiled on a warm rock. Pretty to look at, deadly to touch. Inez Underwood was not the sort of woman who listened to her mother's warnings. That was not entirely fair to say. Inez listened. She was 23 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had passed 2 winters ago from a fever that swept through the county, and a mother, Margaret Underwood, who ran the only seamstress shop in Caldwell with the kind of iron-spined efficiency that kept the family fed and the bills paid, and the gossip flowing in equal measure. Inez had grown up threading needles before she was tall enough to see over the work table, and she could read faster than anyone in town, a fact that had made her more than a few enemies among the boys at the schoolhouse and more than a few silent admirers among the girls. She had a directness about her that people either found deeply refreshing or deeply unsettling, depending on whether they had something to hide. She was standing outside the general store on that Tuesday morning when Amos Hartwell rode past on his bay gelding, and she did not pull her shawl tighter. She simply watched him the way you watch anything unusual pass through an otherwise ordinary day, with curiosity and a complete absence of the fear that everyone else seemed to feel in their bones. He caught her looking, which was precisely what she had intended, and he touched the brim of his hat in a slow, deliberate way that suggested he was very accustomed to women watching him, and even more accustomed to enjoying it. Inez held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then turned and walked back into the general store without any particular urgency. She thought nothing more of it for about 4 hours. Then her mother came into the shop where Inez was pinning a hem on Mrs. Calloway's Sunday dress and said, in the tone that Margaret Underwood reserved for things she considered genuine emergencies, "That Hartwell boy has taken a room at the Drover's Rest and told Hank Morrow he might stay the season." And then she fixed Inez with a look that said everything else she needed to say without saying a word of it. Inez kept her eyes on the hem. "I expect Hank Morrow is pleased about the income." Inez. "Mama, I am 23 years old." "Exactly," said Margaret Underwood, as though this confirmed her worst fears, and she went back to her sewing. The Drover's Rest was the only saloon in Caldwell worth mentioning, which was not the same thing as saying it was particularly reputable. It served adequate whiskey, hosted irregular poker games of varying legality, and employed 3 women who poured drinks and laughed at the right moments and were the subject of considerable town conversation. The owner, Hank Morrow, was a heavy-set man with a walrus mustache and a surprisingly gentle disposition who allowed no gunplay indoors and ran a tighter establishment than most people gave him credit for. Amos Hartwell fit into the Drover's Rest the way a key fits a lock. Within 2 days he was known by his first name. Within 4, he had won $212 in a poker game against 3 cattle drovers who left looking considerably humbled. Within a week, he had laughed with every woman in the place and made eyes at half of them and meant none of it in any direction that mattered. And he knew that about himself, which was perhaps the most honest thing about him. He was not a bad man in any simple, clean sense. He had never hurt anyone who had not come at him first. He had never stolen anything that was not already in play on a table. He had a way of listening to people that made them feel briefly, brilliantly seen, and if that feeling dissolved when he rode on, well, he told himself they had known what they were getting into. Everybody always knew what they were getting into. That was what he told himself. He first spoke properly to Inez Underwood on a Friday evening, 10 days after his arrival, when she came into the Drover's Rest looking for her friend Clara Hobbs, whose husband had apparently been inside for going on 3 hours and whose dinner was going cold. Inez walked in with the absolute confidence of a woman who belongs wherever she decides to stand, which was something Amos had genuinely never seen in quite that particular form before. Clara's husband, a miserable-looking young man named Tom Hobbs, was at the far end of the bar, and Inez navigated the room without hesitation, passing Amos's table where he was dealing himself a slow, solitary hand of cards simply to keep his hands occupied. "You are holding your cards wrong," she said, without stopping or looking at him directly. He looked up. "I beg your pardon." She did stop then and looked at the hand he had dealt himself with the expression of someone who has noticed a mathematical error on a chalkboard. If you are teaching yourself patience, then never mind. But if you intend to win anything tonight, your thumb is doing you no favors. He stared at her. "I have been playing cards since I was 15 years old. And yet here you are alone on a Friday night, losing to yourself." She gave him a brief, level look that was entirely without cruelty and entirely without apology. And then she continued across the room to collect Tom Hobbs. Amos sat with his cards in his hand and felt, for the first time in a long while, the very particular sensation of being genuinely caught off guard. He watched her collect Tom Hobbs with the efficiency of a woman rounding up a wandering calf, not unkindly, just thoroughly, and then she guided the man toward the door, paused, and looked back at Amos with an expression he could not fully read. "The thumb," she said again, by way of farewell, and she was gone. He looked at his thumb. Then he looked at the door. Then he started laughing, the real kind, the kind that surprised him, and old Hank Morrow behind the bar raised an eyebrow because in 10 days he had never heard that particular sound from this particular man. The following morning Amos Hartwell walked into the seamstress shop. He did not entirely know why he was doing it. He had a torn sleeve on his good shirt that he could have easily taken to any number of people, but he walked into the seamstress shop and the bell above the door chimed, and Margaret Underwood looked up from behind the counter with the expression of a woman who had been expecting something like this, and was not pleased that she had been right. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, and the 2 words contained a small but complete biography of her opinion of him. "Ma'am." He removed his hat, which was the correct instinct. "I was told you do alterations." "We do. I have a sleeve that needs seeing to. Leave it on the counter and come back Thursday." He set the shirt down, and then Inez came through the door from the back room with a bolt of blue calico balanced against her hip and stopped when she saw him. Something passed across her face, quick as a shadow, and then it was gone and she was entirely composed. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. "Miss Underwood," he said, and something about the way he said her name, carefully, as though he had been practicing it, made her look at him with slightly more attention than before. "Your sleeve is torn at the seam," she said, glancing at the shirt on the counter. "It is. It will hold better if we reinforce the whole shoulder while we have it open. It will cost a nickel more." "That seems reasonable." She nodded and picked up the shirt and went back through the door to the workroom. He stood there for a moment with his hat in his hands, and Margaret Underwood watched him with the steady patience of a woman who has sat out many storms and intends to sit out this one as well. "She is not one of your saloon girls," Margaret said, and her voice was not harsh, just clear, the way good water is clear. "No, ma'am," Amos said. "I can see that." He came back on Thursday for the shirt and paid the extra nickel without being asked. Inez handed him the shirt, and their fingers did not touch, and neither of them remarked upon it, but both of them were aware of it in the way you are aware of a sound that stops just before you are certain you heard it. "You did not play cards last night," she said. He looked at her. "How would you know that?" "Clara's husband was there. He came home on time, which means there was no one interesting to play against." She said it completely matter-of-factly, as though this were simply information and not an admission that she had been paying any attention to him at all. He decided to be honest about it. "I went for a ride instead. It was a clear night." "I know," she said. "I was on my front porch reading until about midnight. The sky was remarkable." He looked at her for a long moment. "What were you reading?" She looked mildly surprised, as though she had not expected the question. "Mr. Dickens' Bleak House." "I have read it twice before, but it rewards the return." "I have not read it," he said. "No," she agreed, neither unkindly nor condescendingly, just honestly, and he found that he did not feel diminished by it, which was new. He left with his shirt. He came back the next day with no particular excuse, and simply asked her if she wanted to walk to the river in the late afternoon, because the light was good then, and he had nothing better to do, which was perhaps the least romantic invitation ever extended in the Kansas territory. And she looked at him for a moment with those level, dark eyes and said, "I finish at 4 o'clock." Margaret Underwood watched him leave from behind the counter and said nothing, which cost her more than anyone would ever know. They walked to the Chicaskia River in the early evening of a May day in 1882, when the cottonwoods were putting out their first leaves, and the light was doing the complicated, beautiful thing it does on the plains when the afternoon softens toward dusk. He was not performing for her. That was the thing she noticed first. He was not doing the easy, practiced charm that she had heard about from Clara and Mrs. Calloway and every other woman in town who had watched him from a safe distance and sighed about it anyway. He was simply walking beside her, hands in his pockets, watching the water with an expression that she thought was close to peace, or at least the memory of it. "You are not what I expected," she said. "People never are," he said, and she could not tell if that was something he had said before, something worn smooth by repetition, or something he was discovering as he said it. "Where are you from?" she asked. "Everywhere," he said, and then, because she was looking at him in a way that made evasions feel small, he said, "Originally from a failing cattle operation in western Texas. My father lost it when I was 16. We had nothing left after that, so I left and went after the nothing faster and more efficiently than he had." She was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry about your father's land. It was a long time ago. That does not make it smaller." He looked at her sideways. "No," he admitted, "I suppose it does not." The river moved past them with the slow, confident authority of something that has never needed to explain itself. A red-tailed hawk drifted in a wide circle above the cottonwood trees on the far bank. Amos picked up a flat stone without thinking about it and sent it skipping across the surface 3, 4, 5 times before it sank. "That was 7, Inez said. "That was 5, he said. "7, I counted." He looked at her with a smile that she recognized as genuine, because it did not arrive on his face the way the other smiles did, smoothly and immediately. This one arrived late, like something he had not planned. 7, he conceded. They walked back when the light went fully gold and the first insects began their evening business, and he walked her to the door of the seamstress shop, which was also the door of the house where she lived with her mother, and he held his hat in his hands again and said, "May I call on you again?" She considered him with the directness that he was beginning to understand was simply the way she was built, not unkindness, not challenge, just precision. "You may," she said. "But I should tell you something first." "All right. I have heard everything that people say about you. And I do not entirely discount it, because where there is that much smoke there is usually some fire. But I am not afraid of you, and I am not charmed by your reputation the way some women might be, and I am not looking for anything temporary or convenient. So if that is what this is, it would be kinder to both of us to say so now." He stood very still on the porch step for a moment. He had been assessed before. He had been warned away before, and he had always had an answer for it, something light and deflecting that moved the conversation sideways. But looking at Inez Underwood in the last of the evening light, he found that he did not have a single sideways word available to him. "I don't know what this is," he said at last, and it was the truest thing he had said to a woman in years. She looked at him for a moment and then nodded, as though this were acceptable. "Then I suppose we will find out," she said, and went inside. He walked back to the Drover's Rest in the warm Kansas evening with the peculiar sensation of a man who has been standing on uncertain ground his whole life and has just without warning found a square foot of something solid. He came back 2 days later. And then 3 days after that. And then, without either of them formally acknowledging that a pattern had formed, he was walking with her on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and sitting on the front porch on Sunday afternoons, while Margaret Underwood sewed inside and watched them through the window with the expression of a woman suspended between terror and something she refused to name. The town noticed, of course. The town always noticed everything, and Caldwell in 1882 was a cattle town in full, functioning, noisy life, with the cattle drives coming up from Texas on the Kishom Trail, and the drovers arriving with money and thirst in equal measure, and the businesses of the town expanding and contracting with the seasonal pulse of it all. It was not a quiet place, and nothing that happened in it went unobserved. Mrs. Calloway told Mrs. Patterson that it would end in tears. Clara Hobbs, who was Inez's closest friend and not entirely without romantic sensibility, thought it was the most interesting thing that had happened in Caldwell since the incident with the Mexican silver trader the previous year, and she said so often and with considerable enthusiasm. Hank Morrow behind his bar noticed that Amos had started coming in later and leaving earlier and was spending considerably less of his time at the poker table, and he thought this was probably either very good or very bad, and he was not certain which. Amos himself was not certain which, and he thought about it more than he was comfortable admitting. He had not lied to Inez on the porch step. He genuinely did not know what this was. He knew what it was not. It was not what he had done in Dodge City or Wichita or any of the dozen other towns he had passed through. It was not performance. It was not the comfortable, temporary warmth of a woman who asked nothing and would be forgotten by the time the county line was behind him. When he was with Inez, he felt the thing he had been riding away from his entire adult life, which was the sensation of being known. And known was terrifying in a way that no amount of dust or distance or whiskey had ever quite managed to be terrifying. Because when someone knows you, you can disappoint them in ways that actually matter. He was sitting with her on the front porch on a warm Sunday in June, 6 weeks after their first walk to the river, when he said, abruptly and without any particular preparation, "I have not been a good man." She had been reading. She put her finger in the book to hold her place and looked at him with the full attention he had come to understand was her particular gift. "By what measure?" she asked. "By most of the standard ones." "Have you hurt people?" He thought about it honestly. "I have disappointed people. I have made promises I did not intend to keep, at least not as thoroughly as I made them sound. I've used charm the way some men use a pistol, to get what I want and not worry too much about what it costs the other party." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you telling me this so I will forgive you for something you have already done, or so I will understand something about what you might do?" He looked at her. "Neither," he said slowly. "I think I am telling you because you deserve to know it, and because not telling you feels like the old way of doing things, and I am tired of the old way." The silence between them was the kind that has weight to it, the kind that means something is being settled. "I appreciate that," she said at last, and she opened her book again, but she did not entirely go back into it, and he could see that she was thinking. After a while she said, without looking up, "My father used to say that a man's character is not what he has been, it is what he chooses to be on any given morning. He was a school teacher, and he believed in the possibility of people the way some men believe in land without needing proof of it. Amos was quiet. Then he said, "He sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I ever knew," she said simply. "Until recently, I thought that standard was probably as high as a man was likely to reach. I am revising that opinion somewhat." He felt the words land somewhere deep and central, somewhere he had not known was tender. He did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not reduce it. He simply sat with her in the evening warmth and listened to the cattle lowing distantly and the town doing its regular Sunday business. And he felt, for the first time he could honestly remember, that he was exactly where he should be. The revision of Amos Hartwell's habits was not a sudden or theatrical event. It was quiet and gradual, and it happened in the space between two people who were paying attention to each other. He began to arrive at the poker table less often, and to leave earlier when he did. He started taking on occasional work, because Inez had mentioned one afternoon without any particular intent that she admired people who built something lasting, and the comment had stayed with him the way a good song stays with you, turning up at unexpected moments. He spoke to a rancher named Bill Aldercott who ran a spread about 8 miles north of town and needed help during the summer grazing season, and he signed on for wages, which was something he had not done in 3 years. It surprised him how much he did not mind the work. He was good with horses, had always been good with horses, and the physical certainty of it, of knowing what the job was and doing it well, was something he had forgotten could be satisfying. He came in from the Aldercott ranch on the evenings he was in town and walked to the seamstress shop smelling of horses and open air, and Inez would meet him on the porch, or they would walk the river road in the long summer evenings, and he would tell her about the day's work, and she would tell him about her day's work, and neither of them spoke about what was happening between them in any formal way, because some things grow better when you do not examine them too directly. Margaret Underwood watched all of this from her position as the most observant woman in Caldwell, Kansas, and she felt the ground of her certainty shifting under her, and she did not like it. But she was also an honest woman, and honesty required her to admit that the man her daughter was walking with in the evenings was not behaving like the man she had been prepared to disapprove of. She confronted this honestly one evening in late June, when Inez came home from a walk with Amos at 8:30 with her hair slightly loosened from the wind, and her eyes bright in a way Margaret recognized with a helplessness that was entirely maternal. "He is changing," Margaret said, and the way she said it was neither approval nor surrender, just observation. Inez stopped in the middle of unpinning her hair. "Yes," she said, "for you. I think," Inez said carefully, "that it is more accurate to say he is changing for himself, and I happen to be present for it." Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment. "That is a very fine distinction." "It is the important one," Inez said. "A man who changes for a woman changes back when she stops watching. A man who changes because he has finally seen himself clearly, that one stays changed." Margaret Underwood turned back to her sewing and said nothing for a good long while, and then she said very quietly, almost to herself, "Your father used to say something very similar about his students." "I know," Inez said. "I learned it from him." The summer deepened. The cattle drives continued to pour through Caldwell, and the town was alive with the particular energy of a place where money and restlessness were constantly meeting each other. And Amos Hartwell was a curious and somewhat unprecedented figure in the middle of it, a man who had arrived with every intention of being temporary, and was finding himself increasingly unable to locate his interest in the road out of town. He had a bad night in July. He should say that plainly. A group of drovers came through from Texas, 3 of them men he had known from his earlier wandering years, and they called him over at the Drovers' Rest with the easy familiarity of the road, and he sat down with them, and there was whiskey on the table and cards already being shuffled, and for a few hours he was very nearly the old Amos, the one who rode light and cared for nothing, and found the whole of life to be a reasonably entertaining card game with no permanent stakes. He won $40. He drank more than he had in months. He laughed too loud and too often, and flirted with one of Hank Morrow's girls in the careless way of old habit, and he did not entirely stop himself until somewhere near midnight, when he caught sight of his own face in the mirror behind the bar and felt, with the sudden clarity that sometimes arrives in the middle of a bad decision, a deep and genuine disgust. Not because someone was watching. No one who mattered was watching. Inez was at home asleep, or reading, or doing whatever she did in the late hours that were her own. But the mirror did not lie, and what he saw in it was the man she had described him capable of being, not the man he had been telling himself, in the weeks since, he was becoming. He set down his cards and said good night to the Texas drovers and walked back to the drovers' rest room he had been renting since the spring, and he lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling for a long time and did the kind of honest accounting that most people avoid because it is uncomfortable, and he had been avoiding for considerably longer than most. He liked who he was when he was with her. He liked the man she was looking at when she talked to him, when she challenged him, when she was quiet beside him, and he could feel the specific, particular warmth of her thinking. He liked that she did not give him the approval he had always used other people to collect, that she treated it like something worth earning in very small and steady increments, which made it the most valuable thing he had ever tried to accumulate. He went to see her in the morning, earlier than was strictly proper, and Margaret Underwood opened the door with the expression of a woman who knows when something has shifted and is cautiously, guardedly beginning to decide whether it has shifted in the right direction. "Is Inez available?" he asked, and he must have looked like something real, because Margaret studied him for a full 3 seconds and then stepped back and let him in. Inez was in the workroom. She looked up when he came in, and she read his face with the directness that never failed to both unsettle and steady him, and she set down her work. "What happened?" she said. He told her. All of it: the poker, the whiskey, the flirting, the mirror. He told her without minimizing or embellishing, just the plain account of it, and he watched her face while he spoke and saw nothing in it that looked like anger or hurt, only a careful, serious attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you for telling me." "That is all," he said. "What else should I say? You did not do anything wrong by my account. You played cards and drank too much with people you knew. It is what you did after that matters. I was nearly back to exactly who I was when I rode in here." "Nearly," she said. "But you are here this morning and you told me the truth, and that is the difference between who you were and who you are becoming. Amos, you cannot change all at once. That is not how it works." He looked at her and felt the thing that had been sitting in his chest for 2 months now with a weight and a warmth he had never known what to do with, and he understood it clearly for the first time. "Inez," he said. "Yes," she said, though he had not yet said what he was going to say. "I am in love with you." She looked at him steadily. Color rose in her face, and she let it, which was its own kind of courage. "I know," she said. "I have never said that to anyone and meant it before." "I know that too," she said quietly. "Does it not feel like too much to say out loud?" he asked, because it did feel that way to him, enormous and irrevocable, like stepping off a high ledge and discovering the ground is closer than you feared. She came around the work table to where he was standing and looked up at him with those clear, precise, dark eyes, and she said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the 3rd Thursday we walked to the river. It felt like too much then. But it is also what is true, and I decided a long time ago that I would rather live in what is true than in something smaller and safer." He reached out and took her hand, and it was the first time he had done so without the pretext of helping her over rough ground or across a ditch in the road. The first time it was simply because he needed to hold her hand, and he felt her fingers close around his with a certainty that he intended to spend the rest of his life being worthy of. "Then I suppose," he said, "that I had better stay." "I think," she said, "that would be very advisable." He kissed her then, for the first time, standing in her mother's workroom with the bolts of calico stacked around them, and the morning light coming through the narrow window, and it was nothing like any other kiss he had collected in his traveling years. It was quiet and deliberate and entirely serious, and when they stepped apart, she was looking at him with an expression he recognized as the mirror of what he felt, which was the clean, breathtaking terror of something real. Margaret Underwood, who had been listening from the other side of the door with more anxiety than she would ever admit, heard the silence after the footsteps stopped moving, and she sat down in her chair with her hands in her lap and thought about her late husband, who had believed in the possibility of people, and she felt, very quietly, a small and careful beginning of hope. The summer progressed with the honest, working heat of the Kansas plains. Amos continued his work at the Aldercott Ranch, and he was good enough at it that Bill Aldercott began to suggest, in the roundabout way of men who do not like to be seen offering anything too directly, that there might be a permanent arrangement worth discussing. The work suited him. He had always known cattle, had grown up among them on his father's failed Texas operation, and there was something in the daily rhythm of it that satisfied a part of him he had been neglecting for years. He told Inez about Aldercott's suggestion on a Thursday evening walk in late August when the heat was finally beginning to soften toward autumn and the cottonwoods along the river were just starting to think about turning gold. "What do you think?" she asked, because she always asked what he thought rather than telling him what she thought first, which he had come to understand was a deliberate practice of hers, giving people room to arrive at their own truth before she offered hers. "I think it might be the first sensible idea I have had in 10 years, he said. "If I combine what I have saved this summer with what I can earn through the winter, come spring I might be able to approach Aldercott about a proper partnership arrangement. He is getting older, his sons have gone east, and he needs a man who knows the work and will commit to it." She listened to all of this with the focused interest she gave everything that mattered to her. "That is a real plan," she said. "Does it surprise you?" "No," she said. "I always believed you were capable of a real plan. I just waited for you to believe it yourself." He stopped walking and turned to look at her in the last amber light. "Inez Underwood," he said, "I want to marry you." She looked at him with an expression he had never entirely seen on her face before, which was the particular expression of a person who has been waiting for something and is now experiencing the reality of its arrival. "That is not a question," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I am asking, would you marry me?" She considered him for a moment with an assessment that was nothing like hesitation and everything like deliberateness. "I would," she said, "but I should tell you something first." "You always have something to tell me first," he said, and there was nothing but warmth in it. "It is always worth saying," she replied. "I will marry you because I love you and because I believe in who you are. Not who you were when you rode in and not some future imagined version either. Who you are right now, this evening in this light. If you are going to build a life here, I want it to be because you want this life, not because you are trying to become someone else." "I am not trying to become someone else," he said. "I am trying to become more completely who I actually am. You made me see the difference." She smiled then, fully and without reserve, and it was the most beautiful thing he had seen on the Kansas plains, which was saying something considerable given the quality of the sunsets. "Then yes," she said. "I will marry you, Amos Hartwell." He laughed, the real laugh, the one that surprised him, and he picked her up and spun her once in the evening air, and she laughed too, and told him to put her down because her hairpin was coming loose, and he set her down and fixed her hairpin for her with hands that were not entirely steady, and she watched his face while he did it with an expression that he would remember for the rest of his life. They walked back to town in the dusk holding hands for the first time in public, and Clara Hobbs saw them from the doorway of her house, and actually pressed her hand to her mouth, and went inside to tell Tom, who was entirely unmoved, but was wise enough to nod at the right moments. Mrs. Calloway saw them from her parlor window, and said to her husband that she had never been so wrong about anything in all her life, which was not strictly true, but was approximately true in the ways that mattered. The conversation with Margaret Underwood was conducted with the gravity and formality that Amos knew the occasion required. He came to the shop the following morning, properly dressed and hatless, and he asked Margaret if he could speak with her privately, and she sat down across from him at the work table with her hands folded and her spine very straight and weighted. He told her his intentions. He told her about the Aldercott arrangement and his plans and his savings and his commitment to building something permanent. He did not tell her what she already knew, which was that he had been something less than commendable for most of his adult years, because she knew it and he knew she knew it, and saying it would not add anything except theater. What he said instead was this: "I know I am not the man you would have chosen for her, Mrs. Underwood. I know I am not the safe choice. But I love your daughter, and I intend to spend my life trying to be equal to her, and I believe, with everything I can offer as honest testimony, that she makes me want to be the man she already seems to think I am." Margaret Underwood sat very still for a long moment. Then she unfolded her hands and folded them again differently, which was what she did when she was thinking something through to its end. "My husband believed," she said at last, "that judgment without knowledge is ignorance wearing a confident hat. I have been judging you on reputation, Mr. Hartwell, and that is not entirely fair." "It was not an unreasonable position," he said honestly. "No," she agreed, "but I have watched you these 3 months. I have watched how you speak to my daughter and how you listen to her, which is the harder of the two, and I have watched you change in ways I did not think men of your particular history generally changed." She paused. "You have my blessing, but I am telling you plainly that if you break her heart, there is no distance far enough for my purposes." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he meant it as the most sincere thing he had said in the conversation. "Also," she said, reaching for her work again, "the sleeve you brought in back in May needed a full replacement, not a repair. I repaired it because it was the first time we met. When you tear the next one, bring it in properly and we will do it right." He looked at her and understood that this was as close to welcome as she was going to offer right now, and that it was entirely enough. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." They were married in October, 6 months after Amos Hartwell had ridden into Caldwell on his bay gelding, and every mother on the street had pulled her shawl tighter. The wedding was held at the small Protestant church at the end of the main street on a Saturday when the sky was the particular deep blue of a Kansas autumn, and the cottonwoods along the river road had gone properly gold. Reverend Marsh, who was a man of considerable practical good sense, and did not generally trouble himself with a man's past when presented with clear evidence of his present, performed the ceremony. Clara Hobbs cried, which she had been looking forward to doing for months. Tom Hobbs stood beside Amos as the only man Amos had come to genuinely trust in Caldwell, which was Tom's own quiet surprise, since he had arrived at the friendship primarily through the mechanism of being collected from the Drover's Rest by his wife, and finding in Amos a man who found this funny rather than shameful. Hank Morrow attended and gave the couple a bottle of his best whiskey, wrapped in brown paper with a card that said, in Hank's large, careful handwriting, "I always thought you had more sense than you showed. Congratulations." Margaret Underwood stood at the front of the small church and watched her daughter walk down the aisle with the calm, absolute certainty of a woman who knows exactly where she is going, and she felt the tears arrive before she was fully prepared for them, which was unusual for Margaret, and she decided to simply let them come because her husband would have found the whole thing entirely unremarkable and entirely wonderful, and she had been trying, in the 2 years since his death, to see things the way he had seen them. Amos standing at the front of the church, watching Inez come toward him in a dress that Margaret had made herself from ivory cotton with a deep blue ribbon at the waist, because Inez had said she would not wear white and have half the church spending the ceremony making calculations. Amos standing there felt something in his chest open up like a door that had been stuck fast for years. He was not performing. He was not charming anyone. He was simply a man in a church in October watching the woman who had looked at him clearly and seen something he had barely seen himself. And he thought, with a clarity that had no edges to it, that of all the places he had been, and all the mistakes he had made, and all the long, dusty roads he had ridden looking for something he could not name. He had ended up exactly where he was supposed to be. She reached him and looked up at him with those clear, dark eyes and said quietly, so only he could hear, "Stop looking like you are afraid I am going to change my mind." He laughed, and the whole church heard it, and Reverend Marsh smiled patiently and opened his Bible, and they were married. The first winter of their marriage was close and cold, and entirely wonderful. They lived in the small house behind the seamstress shop that had been Inez's parents' home, which Margaret had offered them because she had moved herself into the rooms above the shop, and which they furnished gradually and with great deliberation, choosing things together because Inez pointed out that a house that belonged to both of them should look like both of them had chosen it. Which meant that Amos's battered leather saddlebags eventually sat beneath a windowsill that held 3 books stacked beside a small cloth doll that had been Inez's since childhood, and which she kept not for sentiment exactly, but because it had been her mother's first gift to her, and some things you simply keep. Amos finalized the partnership arrangement with Bill Aldercott in November, which was a matter of considerable satisfaction and some paperwork that Inez helped him read through carefully, because Amos could read but not with the particular speed and precision that she brought to written documents, and because he had learned by then that her precision was one of the most genuinely useful things a man could have access to. Aldercott was pleased. The ranch was called the Double A, and the addition of Hartwell's name to the sign above the gate, which was a small ceremony that Aldercott conducted with unexpected formality, felt to Amos like the planting of something real. He came home in the evening smelling of horses and cold air, and he ate supper at a proper table, and they sat afterward by the small stove with the lamp lit, and Inez read aloud sometimes, and sometimes she sewed and he read on his own, working his way gradually and deliberately through the Dickens novel she had recommended, which he found on the whole more interesting than he had expected. And once when she heard him snort with sudden involuntary laughter at a passage, she looked up with an expression of such complete, unguarded delight that he had to put the book down and go across the room to her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and kissed her on top of her head and went back to his chair, and she watched him go with a smile that she returned to the sewing with, and the lamp burned steadily, and the wind moved outside, and the winter Kansas evening was entirely, sufficiently, beautifully complete. In December, an incident occurred that tested the new shape of things and also clarified it in ways that would not have been possible earlier. A man named Cord Briley rode into Caldwell with 2 others, men who had the specific, worn look of people who have been living outside the law long enough that it shows in how they carry themselves. Briley had known Amos in the old years, had been part of the same circuit of gambling halls and cattle trail whiskey stops, and he arrived at the Double one cold morning while Amos was working the horses in the corral. Briley was the kind of man who understood the world as a series of debts and advantages, and he had come with a proposition that was not truly a proposition but a recruitment. He wanted Amos to ride with him and his men for the winter on an operation he described in vague terms that Amos, who had heard this kind of vagueness before, recognized immediately as cattle rustling at minimum, and quite possibly something considerably worse. Amos leaned on the fence post and looked at Cord Briley for a long moment. "No," he said. Briley looked surprised in the way that men look surprised when they have not actually believed the other person would say no. "Amos, there is serious money in this." "I know how serious your money generally is," Amos said. "No. You used to be fun," Briley said, "and there was an edge under it now." "I used to be a lot of things," Amos said. "Come near this property again, and I will have a conversation with the county sheriff that you will find inconvenient." Briley looked at him for a long, assessing moment, and then he smiled the smile of a man recalibrating a situation, and he rode away, and his 2 men rode with him. Amos told Inez that evening. He told her about Briley and the conversation and the threat which he thought she should know in the plain, factual way that was the way of their house. She listened with her hands folded in her lap, and then she said, "You told him no." "Without much difficulty," he said. She looked at him steadily. "A year ago." "A year ago I might have ridden with him," he said honestly. "Not with pride, but I might have." "You did not," she said. "No," he said, "I did not." She nodded once, and that was all that needed to be said about it. He reported the encounter to Sheriff Connors in town the following morning, and Connors sent word to the neighboring counties, and Cord Briley and his 2 companions were picked up 3 weeks later in a town 20 miles east, attempting precisely the kind of operation Amos had understood them to be planning, and that was the end of that thread. Spring came to Kansas with the particular violence and beauty that the plains do not moderate for anyone. Storms rolling in from the west, and the grass coming up overnight from the black soil, and the whole world smelling of mud and new things. Amos was at the AA from before dawn most days, working the spring roundup with Bill Aldercott and the 2 hands they had taken on for the season, and he came home in the evenings tired in the good, honest way, and ate the supper that he and Inez had taken to making together on the evenings. He was home early enough. Which had started one evening when she was in the middle of baking cornbread, and he had come in, and she had handed him a spoon without thinking about it, and said, "Stir this," and he had stirred it, and the arrangement had simply continued from there. They were in the kitchen on a March evening of 1883, almost exactly 1 year from his arrival in Caldwell, when Inez told him she was expecting their child. She told him in the direct, plain way she told him everything, looking at him fully while she said it, and then she waited to see what would happen to his face. What happened to his face was something she had not entirely anticipated, which was that all the careful, competent, working composure of a man who had learned to be present simply dissolved, and what was under it was something young and open and entirely unguarded. And he sat down heavily in the kitchen chair and put his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. "In September, I think." He looked up at her. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also very happy. Are you all right?" He stood up from the chair and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression she filed away in the deepest part of herself to keep for the rest of her life. "I did not think," he said slowly, "when I rode into this town a year ago that anything like this was something that would happen to a man like me." "What kind of man did you think you were?" she asked softly. "The kind that rides through," he said. "The kind that things do not accumulate for. The kind that travels light because he believes there is nothing heavy enough worth carrying." "And now," she said. He looked at her with the storm cloud eyes that had never in all their time together lost the capacity to move her. "Now I am the kind of man who builds things," he said. "And apparently, it seems, the kind of man who is going to have a child, which is the most extraordinary thing I have ever been." She laughed, and he pulled her close and held her there in the kitchen with the smell of cornbread in the air, and the March wind outside, and his heart doing something so large and complete that he thought briefly it might undo him, and he decided that being undone by this particular thing was entirely acceptable. Margaret Underwood received the news with a contained but genuine joy that she expressed by immediately beginning to sew something small and yellow, on the principle that yellow was appropriate regardless, and by being noticeably warmer to Amos than she had previously managed, which was not entirely effusive but was, for Margaret Underwood, practically a festival of approval. The pregnancy progressed well through the spring and summer of 1883, and the town of Caldwell watched it with the proprietary interest that small towns bring to the milestones of their members, particularly those milestones that feel, in some communal sense, like proof of something. Inez continued to work at the seamstress shop until July, when the heat and the increasing awkwardness of the project made it impractical, and she spent August reading on the porch in the mornings, and doing the books for the double operation in the afternoons, because she had quietly taken over this function in the spring, when she noticed that Amos's accounting was accurate but inefficient. And he had been grateful with the straightforward gratitude of a man who knows when someone is better at something than he is. In September, as she had predicted, their son was born. The birth was attended by the town's doctor, a steady-handed man named Ephraim Cole, who had delivered approximately one-third of Caldwell's population, and had a calm about him that was entirely professional and entirely genuine. Margaret was present and was the most useful person in the room after the doctor himself, which was her nature. Amos waited outside in the way that men waited in 1883, which is to say with barely controlled anxiety pacing a hole in the porch, and when Ephraim Cole opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Hartwell, and your wife is fine," Amos gripped the door frame with both hands and said nothing for a full 10 seconds because there was simply nothing available to say. They named him Thomas James Hartwell, Thomas for Tom Hobbs, who had been a steadier friend than he sometimes knew, and James for Inez's father. And the name suited the baby, who arrived in the world with the calm, dark eyes of his mother and the strong, square hands of his father, and an apparent complete confidence in his right to be exactly where he was, which Inez said was his father's best quality and Amos said was his mother's entire character. And they could not resolve the debate because both of them were right. The first months of Thomas's life were the kind of exhausting, joy-saturated chaos that parenthood generally is, requiring both of them to reorganize their understanding of time, sleep, and priority in ways that were sometimes difficult and always, in the long arithmetic of it, worthwhile. Amos discovered that he was not afraid of an infant, which surprised him, because he had expected to be. He held Thomas with the same careful, attentive quality he brought to horses, the understanding that something young and complete needs patience and steadiness rather than force, and Thomas seemed to find this satisfactory, and slept on his father's chest with a confidence that Amos found simultaneously terrifying and the finest thing he had ever been trusted with. Bill Aldercott came to see the baby in October and stood over the cradle with the expression of a man who has not been in the presence of an infant in many years and is rediscovering that they are smaller than he remembered. "He is a fine boy," Aldercott said. "He is," Amos agreed. "Double A will have a third partner in about 20 years, Aldercott said, and went back out to the corral, which was the most sentimental thing he had said to anyone in living memory. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because a real life never is. There were winters when the cattle prices were low and the books were tight, and Inez sat at the kitchen table with the account spread before her, and worked the numbers with a patience and ingenuity that regularly saved them from situations that would have broken a less clear-thinking arrangement. There were seasons when the grass was poor and the herd suffered for it. There was a drought year when the Chicaskia ran so low you could see the gravel bed, and the whole county held its breath until the autumn rains finally arrived. Amos worked through all of it with the steady, committed discipline of a man who has found the thing he is actually built for and intends to honor it. He had his moments. Everyone who has lived a certain kind of life before has moments, when the old restlessness moved through him like a weather system, when the open road existed in him as a possibility in a way he had to consciously redirect. But he had learned to tell Inez when this happened, had learned that naming it out loud was the thing that diminished its power, and she never received these admissions with alarm or judgment, only with the precise, generous attention that was her particular way of loving him. "Does it still feel like a sacrifice?" she asked him once, on a winter evening when Thomas was 2 years old and sleeping in the next room and the wind was doing its business outside. "No," he said, and it was the truth. "It used to feel like choosing one thing instead of another. Now it just feels like being here." She looked at him with the expression he had come to know was the one she kept for the moments that mattered most to her. "That is the right answer," she said. "I know a few of those now," he said, smiling. "You know more than a few," she said. Thomas Hartwell at 2 was a boy of considerable personality, with his mother's vocabulary and his father's tendency to arrive at situations with complete and possibly misplaced confidence. He was followed in the spring of 1886 by a second child, a daughter, who arrived with considerably less drama than her brother and considerably more noise, and who was named Margaret Eleanor Hartwell, Margaret for her grandmother, who received this information with the most thoroughly dismantled composure Amos had ever seen from that particular woman. Margaret Underwood, who had spent 2.5 years making her cautious and then somewhat less cautious peace with Amos Hartwell, sat down in her chair in the shop and held the news for a moment and then looked up at Amos, who had come to tell her while Inez was resting, and she said, "You named her for me." "It was Inez's idea," he said honestly, "but I did not disagree for a single moment." Margaret Underwood, who had not cried in front of Amos Hartwell before, pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling briefly and then looked back at him with clear eyes and said, "You are a better man than I was prepared to admit. I should have said so before now." "You said it precisely when you meant it," he said. "That is the only time it counts." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded once, and the thing between them that had been careful and slightly formal for all this time settled into something that had room in it now, something that was, if not simple, at least real. Clara Hobbs arrived the following morning with a pie and the most comprehensive list of advice about the care of infant girls that anyone had ever assembled without being formally asked, and Tom Hobbs came with her and shook Amos's hand in the doorway and said, "Two now," with the gravity of a man who understands the weight of the situation, and Amos said, "Two," with the expression of a man who understands it differently and is glad of the difference. The double a ranch expanded in 1887, when Bill Aldercott finally decided that at 71 years old, he was willing to let the younger man take the primary operations forward, and he moved himself to a smaller property on the edge of town where he could grow vegetables and be consulted on matters of cattle wisdom, which he was, regularly, and which he considered a perfectly satisfactory arrangement. Amos hired 2 additional full-time hands and expanded the herd, and built a proper barn to replace the aging structure that had been adequate and was now insufficient. And the Hartwell name on the gate of the double A meant something in Caldwell County that was earned and specific, and had nothing to do with reputation and everything to do with work. Thomas was 5 by then, and could already sit a horse with the easy balance of a boy who has been placed on one since before he could reliably walk, which his father had arranged with the careful, deliberate approach of a man who intends his son to have the things that the land requires. Margaret Eleanor, at 1, was less focused on horses and more focused on the ambitious project of exploring every surface at floor level, which required her mother's constant peripheral attention and provided her father with a reliable source of entertainment. Inez's mother, Margaret the elder, who had been in gradually declining health through the winter of 1887, passed away quietly in February of that year in the rooms above the seamstress shop, in the bed where she had slept alone since Inez's father had died 4 years before. She went gently, which was the mercy of it, and she went with Inez's hand in hers and Amos sitting on the other side of the bed, because he had been there every evening for the 2 weeks of her final illness, not because anyone had asked him to be, but because it was where he was needed, and he had made a practice of being where he was needed. Inez grieved with the honest, disciplined depth of a woman who has thought about loss carefully and refuses to make it smaller by rushing through it. She cried at the right moments and was quiet at others, and she let Amos hold her in the evenings when the children were asleep, and the house was the particular quiet of real grief, and he held her without trying to fix it or diminish it, simply present in the way she had always been present for him, which was the best and most important thing he had ever learned from loving her. They buried Margaret Underwood in the Caldwell cemetery on a February afternoon, with the sky the particular cold, clear blue of a plains winter. And the Reverend Marsh said the right words and the town came, because Margaret had been a fixture of Caldwell for 25 years, and her shop had clothed half the county through weddings and funerals and ordinary Tuesdays alike. Clara Hobbs stood with Inez and held her arm, and Tom Hobbs stood with Amos and said nothing at all, which was exactly what Amos needed from him. Inez inherited the seamstress shop, which she kept for 2 years, running it with the help of a young woman named Rosa Medina, who had the natural skill for the work and the focus required for the detail of it. Rosa was the daughter of a Mexican family who had settled 20 miles south of Caldwell, and whose presence in the county was one of the threads of the broader Western story of the 1880s, a time when the Kansas plains held many different histories in the same ground. Inez had taken Rosa on over some mild community murmuring about the arrangement, having interviewed her with the complete practicality that was her method, and found her both skilled and reliable, and she paid her a fair wage and learned as much from Rosa's particular technique as Rosa learned from hers, and the shop was better for the collaboration. She eventually sold the shop to Rosa in 1889, when the children and the double A and the general fullness of their life made the maintaining of the separate operation more than could reasonably be managed, and she did so at a price that was fair rather than merely possible, because that was the distinction she always made. Rosa ran it well for many years afterward, and became in time one of the more respected women in Caldwell's commercial life, and Inez followed this progress with the specific satisfaction of someone who has handed something forward properly. The spring of 1889 was when Amos Hartwell sat on the porch of the house he had built behind the original small one, a larger house now with a proper parlor and 3 bedrooms, and a kitchen that had actual room in it, and looked out across the Kansas evening, toward the double A property in the middle distance, and thought about everything that had happened since he had ridden into this town 7 years ago on his bay gelding, with no intention of being anywhere specific by any particular time. Thomas was 6 and could already sit a horse better than some grown men. Margaret Eleanor was 3 and had her grandmother's eyes and her mother's precise, unyielding intelligence and her father's laugh, which was the combination that was going to present the world with a genuinely formidable human being in due course. Inez was inside putting Margaret Eleanor to bed, and he could hear the sound of a song she was singing, the same song she always sang at bedtime, a song her father had sung to her, a simple, true melody that came through the open window and across the porch and into the evening air. He heard the screen door, and then she was beside him, sitting in the other chair, tucking her feet under her in the way she did in the evenings when the temperature dropped, and she looked at the evening with the still, attentive quality that was her oldest habit. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything," he said. "Anything in particular?" he considered. "I am thinking that I was 26 years old when I rode in here, and every woman on the street looked at me like I was the worst idea they had ever seen walking on 2 legs. They were not wrong," she said mildly. "They were not entirely wrong," he agreed. "And I am thinking that a man who changes because someone loves him clearly and honestly enough that he can finally see himself the way he is, that is not a small thing." She looked at him. "No," she said, "it is not. I want you to know," he said carefully with the deliberateness he brought to the important things, "that I am aware every day of what I have here. I do not take it for granted. I know what I was and I know what I am now, and the distance between those 2 things is you." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That is not entirely accurate." He looked at her. "The distance between those 2 things is you," she said. "I saw something and I said so, but you did the work. You got up every morning and chose this life. I did not choose it for you. You made me want to choose it," he said. "Yes," she allowed. "But wanting and doing are different things, and you did both of them, and I will not let you credit me with your own character." He looked at her for a long moment with the storm cloud eyes that had not lost their quality in 7 years of Kansas weather and morning light and the particular beauty of being genuinely, durably known by someone. "All right," he said. "Then let us say we chose it together." "That," she said, "is exactly right." She reached across the distance between their chairs and put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around hers with the same certainty she had felt the first time he had taken her hand, which had never diminished even slightly. The evening settled around them. Somewhere across the property, a horse moved in the new barn. The grass spoke in the light wind the way it always did on the plains, a constant, quiet, ongoing conversation that did not require any contribution from them. Thomas was asleep in his room. Margaret Alina was asleep in hers. The accounts were balanced, and the spring work was planned, and the double A was sound. And tomorrow Amos would ride out at dawn, and Inez would be at the kitchen table with the household books, and the children would come down to breakfast in the cheerful, chaotic way of children who are entirely secure in the world they inhabit. They sat on the porch as the stars came out over Kansas, which was one of the great and entirely unremarkable gifts of living on the plains, the sky being simply enormous and full, and they did not need to talk because they were past the age of their relationship where silence needed to be filled, had been past it for years, and the quiet between them was the comfortable, inhabited quiet of two people who have built something real together and are sitting inside it. After a long while Inez said, "Clara told me today that she is expecting again. Is she happy about it?" "She is ecstatic." Tom looked as though someone had told him both wonderful news and also that he would need to sleep less for the next 3 years simultaneously. Amos laughed. "He will manage. He is better at managing things than he thinks." "Most people are," Inez said. "Including me," he said. "Including you," she agreed. She looked at him sideways in the starlight with the small, specific smile that she reserved for moments that were only theirs. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "All right. It seems Thomas and Margaret Alina will not be the only Hartwell children for very much longer." He was still for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Inez." "April," she said. "I think April." He turned in his chair to face her fully, and in the starlight he looked the same age he had been when he had ridden into Caldwell, open and unguarded and entirely real, all the performance and the distance and the careful charm gone as though they had never existed, replaced by this, which was the actual man, the one she had seen past everything else to find. "A third," he said. "Yes," she said. He stood up from his chair and went to his knee beside hers in the way that would have looked to anyone watching like a man proposing, which in a sense it was, a renewed proposal of everything he had already promised, and he took both her hands and looked at her in the dark with all of it visible in his face, the joy and the wonder, and the deep, unsentimental gratitude of a man who knows exactly how unlikely his life turned out to be, and chooses it anyway every morning, without exception. "I love you," he said, with the same plain seriousness he had said it the first time, in her mother's workroom with the morning light and the calico bolts around them. "I love you as completely as I am capable of loving anything." "I know," she said, and held his hands and looked at him steadily, this woman who had never been afraid of him and never been charmed by his reputation and never wanted anything from him that was not true. "I love you the same way." The third Hartwell child arrived in April of 1890, a boy they named William Aldecott Hartwell, William for the rancher who had given Amos the first serious chance. And the old man, when he was told the name, was so thoroughly overcome that he excused himself from the room claiming something was in his eye, and no one called him on it because it was the kindest thing to do. Thomas, who was 7, regarded his new brother with the enormous, proprietorial interest of an eldest child and immediately assigned himself the role of primary expert on all matters relating to the baby, whether or not his expertise was solicited. Margaret Alina, who was 4, decided that the new baby was hers in a specific and non-negotiable sense, and positioned herself as the baby's most devoted guardian, a role she filled with an intensity that was entirely her grandmother's and a warmth that was entirely her father's and a certainty that was entirely her own. The double A grew into the fullness of what Amos had imagined for it, and he ran it with the serious, skilled attention of a man who understands that the land asks something of you, and that what it asks is worth giving. He was known in Caldwell County as a fair man and a hard worker and a good neighbor, and a man who had come from uncertain beginnings and built something solid. And if some of the older residents remembered the stories from Dodge City and Wichita, they generally decided that the man who built the double A and raised 3 good children and walked with Inez Underwood to the river on Tuesday and Thursday evenings the way he still did, 20 years later, was not particularly well described by any of those stories. The mothers of Caldwell who had pulled their shawls tighter on that Tuesday in 1882 lived long enough, most of them, to see Amos Hartwell become the kind of man they would have pointed to as an example. Mrs. Calloway, who had been the most thoroughly wrong about him and had the most thoroughly admitted it, told her granddaughters the story of his arrival and his transformation with the enthusiasm of a woman who has come to appreciate the dramatic arc of it. She was not wrong to find it dramatic. It was. On their 20th wedding anniversary, in October of 1902, Amos and Inez walked to the Chicaskia River in the late afternoon the way they had walked there in the spring of 1882, the first time, the evening of the flat stone that skipped 7 times across the water. The cottonwoods were in their full October gold. The light was doing the long, amber, complicated thing it does on the plains when the world is ending a year. He found a flat stone on the bank and weighed it in his hand. 7, she said before he had thrown it. He looked at her sideways. You cannot know that. I have been counting for 20 years, she said. You always get 7. He sent the stone across the water. It skipped 5, 6, 7 and sank. He turned to look at her with an expression of elaborate defeat. One of these days I am going to get 8. Perhaps, she said. In the meantime, 7 is more than sufficient. He took her hand and they stood by the river in the October afternoon light, and the water moved past them with its old, unhurried confidence, and the gold leaves came down from the cottonwoods in the slow drift of things that have reached their fullness. And Amos Hartwell, who had ridden into this town 20 years ago with the road behind him and nothing ahead of him that he cared to name, stood beside his wife and felt the particular, permanent, unperformable satisfaction of a man who has built his life in the right place with the right person and known it clearly enough to say so, to say it often, to say it today. I am glad I rode in on that Tuesday, he said. I am glad I did not close the shutters, she said. He laughed the real laugh. She looked up at him in the October light, this woman who had never been afraid of him and who had been right not to be, who had seen past everything he had been to what he was capable of being, and had offered him the extraordinary dignity of being seen that clearly, who had loved him without possession and challenged him without cruelty and built beside him a life that was equal to them both. 20 more years, she said. At minimum, he said, and kissed her beside the river in the Kansas afternoon, and the cottonwood leaves came down around them, gold in the last of the light, and the water went on the way it always had, confident and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the business of the world except as a thing that moves through it, which was, Amos thought, not a bad way to finally understand the difference between passing through and truly arriving. He had arrived. He was home. And every morning from here forward, he would choose it again.